You know, to really flesh out some of the things that we were just hearing about, our next session is all about how to make Detroit more techonomic, and it includes a couple of really amazing people. Come on out, guys. The moderator's going to be Ed Luce, who's the chief U.S. commentator of my favorite business paper, the Financial Times, my favorite orange paper also. And our great local leader, Dan Gilbert, is on the panel, as well as Bruce Katz from the Brookings Institution, who is a great leader and thinker about what's making cities great. So come out, guys. Ed, thank you. Bruce.
How are you? How you doing?
I want to add one thing. One of the reasons we love this auditorium is there's a lot of space between the rows, so don't hesitate to fill in. There's people coming in. We want to fill up the space.
Move along one, whichever. David, thank you very much. This is a very brief session, 25 minutes, with a hard stop because the governor is coming straight afterwards. So if you two don't mind, I'm going to be quite sort of rude and House of Commons-ish in terms of interrupting and heckling if you give long answers. Great privilege to be and pleasure to be on the stage with both of you in different ways. Dan, because I think you're the only person I know who single-handedly managed to turn an ailing metropolis's downtown around, and I think we're all familiar with that story, but we'd love to hear more of that.
I just want to tell you, it's first of all, definitely wasn't single-handedly.
No, that was an exaggeration.
There's a lot of people
here. Largely you.
A lot of great people here before we even got here that had it on the right path, and we're just fortunate enough to join in. So.
I'll get you to the first question in 1 second, but Bruce, because for those of us who live in Washington, D.C. and are in despair about the federal system's ability to address America's problems, Bruce tells a story of a federal system below the top level of government that is thriving and experimenting. And he's also a very generous colleague introducing me to people like Dan. So Dan, I'd like to start with you. I used to be based in India, and so I'm very familiar with cities that have highly innovative city centers and downtowns, but where you can see slums stretching out as far as the eye can see, and the two don't seem to meet that much. What is it about Detroit and your incredible success in the downtown and the midtown here that gives you confidence that this is going to be scalable, that the 93% of Detroit that isn't thriving is going to become 80%, 70%, 60%? How do we get there?
Well, I think first of all, to have any great city, major city, you have to have a great, thriving downtown. There's no city I can think of, probably in the world, certainly in this country, that you can say, all the neighborhoods around it are doing really well and thriving, but downtown stinks, right? There's just, that doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist for a reason because, downtown is the heartbeat. Downtown is where there's a lot of jobs, and, more producing jobs anyway than anywhere in a major city. So when you have a thriving downtown that has activity, action, and growth associated with it, you're going to hire a lot of people who live in those neighborhoods or will live in those neighborhoods. So that's number one. Number two is just on a strategic, tactical viewpoint from Detroit. To get the neighborhoods going, we've got to take down the 78,000 or so, we don't even know the exact number, structures that need to be taken down, mostly houses. Once we can get that done, you're going to have open pieces of land, and you're going to have, more importantly, hope and optimism. I mean, I was at the White House a couple weeks ago. We were talking to several of the secretaries in the cabinet about this very issue. And the thing is, the money is actually there. There's money available to do this. It's just a matter of getting the infrastructure in place and getting ourselves in a position to actually make it happen.
You're saying the federal government will be an important component?
The federal government will absolutely be important. There's actually, there's money in different places right now that we can get it done. But when you think of a 10-year-old kid, walking to school in a neighborhood, and you can give him all the hope you want in the world and sing and dance and tell him, hey, look at downtown, look how great it is, look at all these jobs one day you could potentially be part of. But when he's got to walk by 3 burnt out houses and one of them's got, a crack dealer or something going on inside of him, he's going to see that. And so, you can put all the education stuff needs to happen. Of course, crime is important and all this stuff. But for me, tactically, number one, we have got to get these these buildings and these structures down. And once we do, you're going to have a lot of people look at this, both who live in the neighborhoods and developers, builders are going to look at this and say, wow, what an opportunity. We've got utilities, we have streets in place, all the old decrepit buildings are gone, and we're going to have kids and families who feel better and safer. And so to me, it's number one that we have to do to get the neighborhoods going.
Bruce, bearing in mind your very well-grounded skepticism and how efficient and helpful the federal government is as a partner to cities and states, to what degree do you think realistically the federal government will participate in Detroit as a whole's revival in the coming years?
So one of the things we need to do is to teach the federal government what they do, because they are probably the biggest single investor in this city and in this metropolis because of entitlement transfers, whether it's Medicaid or food stamps or the earned income credit, whether it's investments in advanced R&D, as in Wayne State and other universities, University of Michigan, MSU. And then they are part of the solution to infrastructure, to housing, to the demolition of abandoned property that Dan is talking about. The challenge we have with our federal government right now is they don't know what they invest and they don't know where they invest. So I think what Dan is talking about is a very practical, pragmatic solution. Let's unveil for them where they already spend money and really challenge them to help that funding become more flexible and in the service of a vision of the city. You can't set a vision in Washington, D.C. It has to be set here.
Has to be set here, and then you have to, as a city, force the feds to respond to that? I mean, is there a model of how a city uses the federal government well to assist itself?
So here's an example. 5 years ago, beginning of the recession, Los Angeles passes Measure R, $40 billion in sales tax revenue to build out their transit system. Because the recession was so hard and it hit LA so hard, they went to the federal government and basically said, give us an innovative loan and we can do the construction not over 30 or 40 years, but within 10 years, and have that big bang effect on jobs and growth. Took 3 years to get, and ultimately Mayor Villaraigosa had to get dozens of other cities to come around, but ultimately that was passed last year. Washington does occasionally do something, and because of that, LA is now moving fast to sort of build out the transit system.
You know, one of the things I learned just on this recent trip, actually, and I've heard bits and pieces of this before, but there's an enormous amount of money, more than people even know about, that has been targeted and set aside over the last several years for Detroit, that Detroit, and other cities, by the way, not just Detroit, have not accessed. Only because they haven't figured it out, whatever you want to call it, the bureaucracy, in Washington to figure it out, or having the infrastructure and the amount of people here who can execute on the ground and give people in Washington, the confidence that they're going to use these funds in the manner in which they're targeted. So a lot of this is not money or lack of money. A lot of it is, having the talent and having the infrastructure to execute on programs that are already there.
So tell me about the bankruptcy. I mean, I'm obviously aware of, partly because of your help, both of yours help, about the degree to which downtown has revived, and I've written about it. But I can't get past some skepticism there. People say, but Detroit's bankrupt. What to both of you, does this bankruptcy mean? Is it an opportunity? And if so, what's the likely scenario to result from this bankruptcy once the city's graduated, as it were?
Well, I'm wearing a shirt that says Opportunity Detroit, so there's definitely, my view,
you see it as an opportunity.
There's definitely an opportunity. I think Kevin Orr, the financial manager here, put it really, really correctly a few weeks back when he said, we're already, this is before the bankruptcy, when they were talking about whether we were going to file or not, we're already bankrupt. I mean, just because you file bankruptcy, that's a formal legal sort of rubber stamp thing. I mean, we were bankrupt already, and probably if you looked at our balance sheet, looked at Detroit's balance sheet, that was probably the case for many, many years. I don't know exactly how many, but many years. So I think really this was just a formal manifestation of what already was taking place, and it's the beginning of the end of the bad financial issues. There's no question we come out of bankruptcy. I'm not going to sit up here and say it's not going to be painful for many people, but it will be, but it will absolutely give Detroit the new start that it needs. Just remove the complete overhang and all the kinds of financial weight that has frozen the city to a degree. I mean, and I think it'll do what it did for General Motors and Chrysler. Nobody talks about the bankruptcies of the automobile companies anymore, and they're thriving right now. So I see Detroit in the same light.
So I've always thought that Scott Fitzgerald quote, "There are no second acts in American life," is the most inaccurate
That's absolutely
quote. Presumably you see this.
Well, I worked through the Washington, D.C. receivership back in the mid-'90s, and that was a fundamental reset because A, it got the fiscal house in order, B, it made government efficient and capable and competent again. Dan's thought about why they're not able to access federal resources. But third, we should remember that cities, unlike the federal government and unlike state governments, are not governments. Cities are networks. Cities are networks of institutions, companies, universities, entrepreneurs, philanthropy. And I think what you've seen in Detroit over the past 5 years in particular is the network beginning to work together. They can always do things by themselves, but when they come together, they can make the kind of sizable investments and frankly then lead the government to make other investments. And that's what we found when we tracked the federal funding. FHA, SBA, Ex-Im, they're following the investments in the core because that's where you have market momentum and that's where your assets, attributes, and advantages are disproportionately concentrated.
Is there another city that Detroit should look to as a model for reviving, or is this just sui generis? Detroit is Detroit. It's got to find its own way forward.
I think there's two things here. I mean, if you want to look for cities that were able to shrink in rational ways to their areas of opportunity, you look to East Germany. You look to Dresden, you look to Leipzig, because after the wall came down, you had an exodus of business and talent from the east to the west, and they had to rationalize their spatial landscape. So we can take a page from that. On the American side, I think it comes down to metrics, because the one metric I look at is what portion of metropolitan jobs are in your downtown and midtown. In this region, only 7%. Cleveland and Philly, 15%, Chicago, 20%, and New York City, 31%. If you could double the portion of metropolitan jobs that are in this downtown and midtown,
well,
this city will
this is a question,
will
this
begin
is a question
to take off.
for Dan. Dan, how do you sell Detroit to investors?
Well, Detroit sells itself. I mean, that's the thing. We had 1,100 interns this summer from 157 colleges and universities across the United States. And one of the little-known things is that we had 19,000 applications for these internship jobs. 19,000. I mean, we couldn't even figure out, did we get the best 1,100? Who knows? But, because you're putting those folks through the interview process. But my whole point here is that once those folks got down here, just like when investors come down here, just like when we had Steve Ballmer, we took him through on a tour not too long ago, and there's a bunch of people that are coming through here.
Is he looking
every
for a
day.
Retirement home?
Well,
yeah. I couldn't.
There's a condominium we showed him that we thought. No, this was before. Actually, it was a few weeks before. I wish I would have known. But they are amazed and wowed. You take them to the riverfront and show them what's happened over there, which is probably, in my view, and we had nothing to do with that. That was well done before we got here. I mean, that is one of the most undertold stories, I think, in the history of cities. I mean, to take, 3.5 to 5, and we'll be 5 miles of what was wasteland and all kinds of toxic waste and turn it into what it is today and getting better every year is just incredible. And it's an incredible attribute for Detroit. And then you take them to Midtown and show them everything there, and you take them to Campus Martius and you show them some of our stuff around it and everybody in the museums and everything else. Detroit absolutely sells itself to both young people, investors, out of town. They're sort of amazed because they have this perception that's, the expectation is so low, and you show them something here, the gap is it's huge. And there's not a single person we've taken through and said, it's a little bit not as good as I thought it was going to be here,
It is difficult.
It just doesn't happen. So.
That rings true. We're going to go to a couple of questions in a second, but I have one eccentric question to ask both or either of you. which is given the vast geographic size of Detroit relative to other cities, given that you have a wonderful eastern market here, what potential is there for urban farming?
I think there's enormous potential, actually, for urban farming, but it has to be part of this broader shrinking city strategy. I mean, 138 square miles. This is a very, very large city. I mean, you could put San Francisco, Manhattan, and Boston and other cities in here, and you'd still have room. So there really has to be a strategy for how you shrink a city, but it's shrinking to strength. There is strength here, and I think that's the contrarian story that really has been masked by the bankruptcy. So I think there's a play for urban agriculture. There may be a play for manufacturing, both traditional and small batch. You already see that with Shinola in Midtown. There absolutely has to be a play for life sciences and some of the innovative assets that this state has that actually could come to ground and have a synergistic effect through density.
Yes, I'm one of these guys, and maybe I'm out of my mind, which I am for various reasons, but I think if you go back to that point I was making earlier, you get these structures down, and I mean all of them, not some of them, not most of them, all of them. And we'll put a big board up, like a reverse tote board, count it down for each structure down to 0. I think my gut is that we will be amazed at how quickly these neighborhoods and this land gets redeveloped, because nobody is going to walk in to this land and say, I want to do something here with that kind of blight. When that blight is gone, maybe we won't have to be talking about shrinking cities, because there'll be such a rush of people who want to get into low value housing. Remember, when all these utilities are there and the land is pretty much close to free, not exactly free, but close to it, and all those utilities there you don't have to pay for, it becomes very cheap for a builder-developer to develop a residential unit, and they're going to develop them, and they're going to develop them in mass as soon as we get these structures down, and maybe we won't have to worry about raising peas or corn or whatever it is you do in the farm. So,
fair enough. We've got 5 minutes, so I guess this is 2-3 questions maximum, and abbreviated answers. So if you could, I can't really see very well, and I don't know, is there a mic system? There is.
Hi. So I think that one of the reasons for the disconnect between the federal government and the city is that the U.S. is in the somewhat unique position of having a majority of its capitals outside of large metropolitan areas, both Detroit and New York being not capitals of their states. And so especially Mr. Katz, how do you see, how do you kind of explain that part of what the federal government is doing with their money, by really leaning heavily on what can be seen as anti-urban policies like subsidizing corn and highways?
So listen, I think if we're talking about legislative change, whether it's in Washington or whether it's in Lansing, there's a political math here, right? Cities and metropolitan areas, particularly the top 100, are 2/3 of our population, 3/4 of our GDP, and drive the entire American economy. So they don't tend to work together, cities and their suburbs, to basically push for legislation, particularly around the things that matter: investments in innovation, investments in infrastructure, investments in education and skills. In states like Colorado, where the cities and suburbs do work together, the state government tends to act in the service of their major metropolitan area, Denver. This is about political coalition building, both with governments, but then this broader civic and business and philanthropic network coming together as the engines of the economy, and basically saying, if you want high return on investment with your policies, state or federal, here's where you invest.
Please. Yes.
I have a question. I have a question over here.
Oh.
Thank you very much for being here. Andrew Humphrey, WDIV Detroit. Also on the political view, for all the panelists essentially, how do you overcome political gridlock? On the federal side, gridlock that seems to be based mostly on ideology and not on taking care of human beings, and locally here in Detroit, the political gridlock that exists at times as well.
Dan, you've just been to Washington.
Oh, well, first of all, I look at government is sort of, I think government should take the oath that I think doctors take, and that is first, do no harm.
Absolutely.
Okay? That's number one. And, you know, not that the government, there isn't a role, because there's certainly a role in many areas for government, but I think, you know, this country was founded on a limited government, limited role, and letting people express themselves in free markets and free thought and being able to create stuff. So, you know, to me, if the gridlock prevents them from causing things that shouldn't be done, you know, governments that can do on the negative side, maybe that's good. On the bad side, if there's things that absolutely are the proper role for government and are not being done, then gridlock becomes a problem. So, I mean, that's probably more than a 25-second response to that.
And I can
question.
add a cheeky follow-up, which is, what more can Governor Snyder do for you?
Well, what does cheeky mean? First of all, I don't know.
Cheeky.
You know,
It's an Anglicism. It's an Anglicism.
Okay.
Mischievous.
Oh, mischievous. Okay. I went to Michigan State. I don't know these words. You know.
Cheeky is not Latinate, I can assure you. This is like,
I do know that how come when a moderator is, are you from Britain, right? Or, just the questions sound so much more better. They sound more intelligent. I don't know.
It's an illusion, I can assure you.
I forgot the question now. Sorry.
Governor Snyder, you didn't forget.
Okay. But what about him? Is he cheeky? I don't know what those questions.
What more can the state do for you and the governor?
Well, first of all, again, I think this governor has done a really good job, because I think he's had to make decisions. He's willing to make decisions that are not popular. I think that, you know, when a politician, as most of them do, start becoming about who and not what, you know, they're about who and not what, you know, trying to have everybody like them, I think that's when you start having problems. When you're willing to make a decision about what is best for everybody, regardless of what anybody thinks of you, I think you're going to be better off. A politician's never going to make a decision, a big one, where everyone's going to say, hey, great decision. So that, at least I think he's been supportive in that way.
He's been supportive, Bruce?
And I would agree that Governor Snyder has been very supportive. I would just say for all states, they tend to spread their money like peanut butter across the state. It's more of a legislative strategy than a market strategy. Get behind the momentum in downtown and midtown Detroit. That's how you will grow a great metropolis and a great state.
Well, thank you. Thank you to both of you. Really enjoyed that.